I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It was one of those mornings that appear, at first glance, to promise very little. The rain had washed itself out by dawn, leaving the pavements shining like varnished wood, and I found myself once again seated in the Randolph, as though the place had claimed me with the inevitability of gravity. A half-pint of bitter stood before me, untouched longer than I should admit, and beside it lay the crossword from the Times, folded neatly, as if ritual might offer some order to the disarray of thought that has never quite left me. The bar was quiet at that hour. A few tourists hovered by the far window, murmuring over guidebooks, their voices soft enough to blend into the hum of the city beyond. Through the glass, I could see the bicycles moving like clockwork pieces, bells ringing with a faint optimism I could neither share nor despise. Life in Oxford often had this rhythm, the impression of continuity, even as lives slipped away unnoticed behind college walls. I stared at a clue that refused to yield. 7 letters. Definition. Passage. Concealed within. I traced the letters I had already set down, scratched one out, replaced it, only to find the word collapsing again into incompleteness. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that puzzles often resist the impatient, rewarding instead those prepared to sit with silence. And silence was something I carried too easily. It was during one of those pauses, when I had let my gaze wander to the condensation gathering along the rim of my glass, that I heard the remark. A man at the bar, speaking without urgency, to no one in particular, a local perhaps, or a visiting scholar. His tone was faintly amused, though the words themselves were not. The door was open, he said. The key was inside. He chuckled as though at a private joke, and his companion, a younger man, offered no reply beyond the shifting of his stool. I cannot explain why the phrase held me. Perhaps because it belonged to that class of remarks one feels one has already read somewhere. In a forgotten stanza, a newspaper clipping, or the final entry in a diary. It hovered between banality and omen, refusing to declare which. I folded my crossword, finished my drink in 2 careful sips, and let the words lodge themselves, unwanted, in the corner of my mind. Oxford on such mornings has its peculiar scent, damp stone, ink from the Bodleian carried faintly on the breeze, the faint bitterness of old beer poured too early. I walked out into it, my steps unhurried, though something in me wished to follow the 2 men in their conversation. Instead, I let them drift away towards Beaumont Street. There are times when one learns more by remaining behind. The crossword still troubled me. A concealed passage, a door open, yet the key inside. The juxtaposition stirred uneasily, as though language itself had arranged a riddle for my benefit. I stood by the Sheldonian for a while, watching a woman lock her bicycle with fastidious care. She placed the key in her coat pocket and patted it twice, as if to assure herself of her own security. I wondered how many tragedies had begun with precisely that gesture, the illusion that safety was ever more than temporary. By midday, I'd returned to my rooms, the crossword folded once again on my desk. Lewis telephoned with some minor update about a traffic accident on the Abingdon Road, but I barely listened. I scribbled the troublesome clue on a separate scrap of paper and left it on the mantelpiece, certain that sooner or later the word would emerge. It always did. Yet what persisted was not the puzzle, but the overheard phrase, repeating itself like the refrain of an unwelcome song. Later that afternoon, in a moment of idle curiosity, I looked again at the clue. Passage, concealed within. The answer, of course, was corridor. How easily overlooked, how blandly obvious once seen. I wrote it down with a sense of irritation rather than satisfaction. Corridor, a word that opens onto so many doors, most of them closed, a few perhaps ajar. I did not know then, though I half suspected, that the remark in the Randolph would return to me, insistent, when a man was found dead behind one of Oxford's many doors. And when it did, I would remember not the chuckle nor the young man's silence, but only the peculiar chill that had settled in me that morning, uninvited, as if some key had already been turned. News in Oxford is a patient pilgrim. It circles the quads in whisper and weather before consenting to print. By the time Lewis found me, the rain had resumed its catechism upon the stone and saint. Eligius looked the colour of pewter and unfinished thought. He said there had been a discovery on the fellow's staircase, an office door that yielded too easily, and we crossed the quad together while the phrase from yesterday kept pace beside me like an unwelcome hymn I could not silence. The door was open. The key was inside. The porter received us with the careful sorrow of a man entrusted with keys and therefore with blame. His cap shone with rain. His voice kept to dim corridors. He led us along a passage whose floorboards remembered everyone who had ever argued here, and he told the tale he knew how to tell. Dr. Julian Petherick had failed to appear at tutorials. A colleague had knocked and heard only the industry of rain. The master key had turned in a lock that offered no indignation. The body was within. The key lay upon the desk as if it had been thinking about nothing at all. The porter insisted the door had been closed. He did not need to insist. I believed him because the building did. We entered as one enters a chapel. Petherick's room displayed a literature of tidiness, books arranged into parties that disapproved of one another, papers aligned with the librarian's patience, a pen at right angles to a blank page as if awaiting a sentence that would no longer consent to arrive. Petherick rested between desk and window, one arm folded under him, the attitude of a man listening closely to the floor for a last, precise truth. Colour had left his face without drama, which is the most tragic way to go. Near his hand sat a glass that still remembered whiskey. Lewis, who knows how to be quiet in a room, took his time with the arithmetic of death. No sign of struggle. The sash was latched from within, the cords frayed but intact. The fireplace was a relic from a winter long gone. On the broad oak desk lay a small brass key, centrally placed upon a blotter as though the desk were a small stage and the key its only actor. The arrangement suggested competence rather than grief. I examined the lock with the attention I usually reserve for music, for there is rhythm in good carpentry and sometimes a wrong note. A modern cylinder, unbruised, the plate unwarped. I turned the desk key in my palm. A faint dust of blue came away on my thumb, the ghost of a cheap stamp pad or a tired ribbon. Irrelevant, perhaps, but irrelevance often rehearses for importance, and I have learned not to ask it to leave. The college nurse waited in the passage, the polished calm of the trained gathering about her like a cardigan. She spoke of stillness, and of nothing else, and I thought how death empties the air of everything except the need to speak softly. The porter admitted, with the reluctance of a practical man who distrusts imagination, that he had heard a single hollow sound earlier, something like furniture remembering its weight. He had thought nothing of it, which is what we all do before the thing that matters explains itself. Back at the desk I read a letter placed face up in the in-tray. Departmental paper. Polite phrases set like chessmen who have agreed not to move. Petherick declined an invitation to chair a seminar. I read the paragraph twice because neat refusals so often hope for contradiction. The signature ran hurried until the final flourish upon the last letter, a theatrical ending appended to a modest refusal. Ornament, when despair is supposed to be present, makes a small noise in my head. Lewis, kind as always, wondered whether we were looking at the obvious. A solitary fellow in his late 40s, a drink untouched to the bottom, a door without grievance, a key inside the room. He did not say the word. Suicide travels most comfortably without being named. I said we would invite the pathologist to argue with us and let time make its small corrections. The room resumed its hush as if that were what it had been wanting all along. I turned again to the key. Its position felt rehearsed. Beneath it, the blotter kept a faint rectangular shadow, as though something heavier had occupied that place and been removed with careful hands. A book, perhaps, a small box. I traced the outline with a nail and found, at the corner, a whisper of the same weak blue that lingered on my thumb. The window latch wore a crescent of newer varnish that trespassed upon older wood, a tidiness where no dirt had been admitted. Someone had burnished the unneeded. It is a habit I distrust in people and in rooms. We asked about keys. The porter recited the college catechism, 3 only, the one on the desk, the master at his chain, a duplicate sleeping in the safe to reassure committees who fear the unexpected. No others, unless one wished to count the imaginary keys that live under flower pots in novels. He believed what he said. I believed he believed it. I studied the shoes. One lace looped twice, the other once. A trifle, and therefore a kind of message. Yesterday's crossword wandered back through memory. Passage, concealed within. A corridor where none was drawn on any plan. I felt the neat story press itself upon me with all the confidence of an undergraduate who has not yet met his first contradiction. Suicide would have pleased the paperwork and preserved the college's sense of itself. The glass perfectly centered, the letter perfectly placed, the key theatrically obedient. Even the air smelled arranged, paper and leather, and a thread of damp wool that did not belong to the tweed upon the chair. I distrusted the room as one distrusts a conversation that arrives already concluded. When we left, Lewis began the calls that keep death lawful. I lingered under the fanlight where the staircase stored its cold. Somewhere in the quad, a clock produced a single undecided note and refused to repeat it. Behind the sealed door, the papers waited to become evidence or poetry, depending on who read them. The porter touched his cap and repeated that the door had been closed and the key had lain inside. I let the words return to their weary shape and wondered, not for the first time, whether tidiness isn't simply the kindest mask that falsehood knows how to wear. Colleges in mourning do not wear black. They wear routine. The bell strikes as it always does. Porters shuffle keys. Students whisper in cloisters, and yet the air trembles with a silence too deliberate. At St. Eligius, grief manifested itself in carefully folded gowns and the polite sorrow of fellows who had already begun to measure the absence of Julian Petherick against their own survival. Lewis and I were received in the senior common room, a chamber where oak paneling had absorbed centuries of rivalry and yet pretended to display only learning. Dr. Rowan was first to speak, his tone polished by a life of declension and disdain. A tall classicist, his face chiseled into severity by years of Greek and the absence of humor. He murmured that Petherick's death was tragic but hardly unexpected. He had, Rowan observed, always suffered from a certain lack of equilibrium, by which he meant weakness. His voice carried the mild relish of a man who finds himself confirmed by the misfortunes of others. He turned his gaze to me, steady, uncompromising, as if daring me to find a contradiction in his Latin certainties. I noted the precision of his cufflinks, their bronze edges polished more than required, and wondered at the energy one spends to keep appearances exact. Anthony Fell was different altogether. He arrived late, spilling apologies with the confidence of a man accustomed to forgiving himself. Younger than Rowan, with an easy charm that must have played well in lecture halls, he wore his gown like a prop in a play he had not rehearsed. He spoke warmly of Petherick, insisted he had been a generous colleague, and yet in the pauses his eyes darted toward the door, as if some other obligation tugged at him. His laughter, offered once to lighten the mood, echoed too loudly against the carved ceiling. I recalled whispers of debts in the bursar's office, the kind of debts that teach a man to improvise his morality. Then there was Helen Marbury. She remained seated by the fire, her hands folded upon her lap with the kind of stillness that unsettles more than agitation. A historian of medieval economies, though her reputation rested equally upon her ability to keep confidences. Her face was striking not for beauty, but for control, the eyes watchful, as if they had rehearsed every possible expression and chosen silence as the safest. She spoke softly of Petheric's scholarship, his keen attention to detail, his occasional melancholy. Her voice betrayed nothing, but her choice of words lingered oddly in the ear, as though she had edited herself too quickly. It was during this recital of restrained grief that she allowed a phrase to escape. She quoted Milton, or believed she did, saying of Petherick that he had light refused to dwell. A small thing, barely noticeable, yet I felt the line scratch against memory. The original passage, of course, declared that light refused to dwell upon the eyes of fallen angels, not the mind of a scholar. A subtle shift, perhaps accidental, but it clung to me like a burr. Misquotation is often no crime, yet in a college where precision is currency, such lapses ring oddly. I wrote nothing down. I prefer to let such fragments breathe, to see where they wander in the mind. Lewis asked his dutiful questions. Last sightings, letters received, any hint of distress, and each fellow offered what civility demanded. Rowan repeated that Petherick had been unstable. Fell claimed he had spoken cheerfully with him not a week before. Helen only remarked that Petherick had seemed preoccupied, but then scholars always were. Their words lay on the table like arranged fruit, gleaming, untouched, and curiously tasteless. As we left the common room, the air carried the faint bitterness of extinguished coal. Lewis muttered that they had been civil enough, but too rehearsed, as if their grief had been distributed in advance like lecture notes. I said little. My eyes had drifted to the register of attendance on the sideboard, where the signatures sprawled with varying degrees of haste. Fell's name slanted downward like a man losing his balance. Rowan's marched with unwavering formality. Helen's was compact, sealed, and undecipherable. In the quad, rain resumed its gentle doctrine on the stones. I thought again of Milton, of the light that does or does not dwell, and of how the smallest error in quotation may tell us more about memory than about poetry. I folded the observation inward, a quiet page added to the growing file inside my head, and followed Lewis back through the cloister, where every echo suggested that Petherick's death had not yet finished speaking. The library of St. Eligius smelt of dust and reprieve. It was one of those places where the air seemed to move reluctantly, as though each draught disturbed a century of careful shelving. I went there not with purpose, but with instinct, a dull magnetism that draws me always towards the detritus of the past. Lewis trailed behind, his shoes squeaking faintly upon the parquet, and I caught the porter's shadow at the door, curious but unwilling to trespass further. The archivist, a pale figure with spectacles that enlarged his eyes to an owl's disquiet, guided us towards a drawer of photographs. He muttered that Petherick had been engaged in a minor project of college history. Nothing to trouble the statutes, merely a collection of portraits for a prospective book. His voice carried the strained reverence of one who has lived too long among the dead. He produced a cardboard box, lined with the yellowing smell of paper that has seen too much of itself. Inside, photographs lay in brittle rows, groups of fellows arranged like reluctant choristers, gowns flowing, smiles hesitant, a stiff parody of camaraderie. They were images not of faces, but of pretensions, men and women caught forever at the moment before their eyes gave them away. I lifted one at random, the year written in careful fountain pen along the border. There was Petherick, younger, his hair less withdrawn, his mouth trying for a seriousness he would later perfect. Around him stood the other names, Rowan already severe, Fell still carrying the grace of youth, and Helen, her gaze turned slightly aside as though she had always mistrusted the camera. But it was not their presence that unsettled. It was the absence. One face, third from the left, had been scratched out with deliberate strokes of penknife or nail. the emulsion torn, the features obliterated into a blur of violence. Not an accident, not the wear of years, but intention. I let my thumb travel the ridges of the paper. The scars caught the light like old wounds. Lewis frowned, suggested some prank, an idle hand from a careless student. The archivist shook his head quickly. He said Petherick himself had returned this photograph years ago and had quarreled bitterly with the man whose face now lay erased. A quarrel that echoed through committees, that poisoned senior dinners, until the man resigned his fellowship and drifted into anonymity. The archivist could not recall his name with certainty. Harrington, or perhaps Harriman. He adjusted his glasses, his voice fading into the shelves, embarrassed at the limits of memory. I replaced the photograph upon the desk, though its outline remained in my palm, a ghostly indentation. The scratched-out fellow stood still among his intact colleagues, more present in his obliteration than they in their survival. Petherick had kept this photograph, returned it, quarreled with it. He had not destroyed it outright. He had needed the reminder. We keep our enemies alive through the rituals of remembrance. Lewis busied himself with other images, tracing the evolution of the college's vanity. He muttered that quarrels were the common coin of academic life, that professors collected them the way students collected essays. I did not argue. Yet I felt the unease of something pressing through the paper, as if the past had been rehearsing its entry for years. The scratched face was not gone. It was amplified, its silence more articulate than speech. Outside, rain glazed the leaded windows into watery mirrors. I studied the photograph once more before leaving. Petherick's eyes seemed to glance sideways, away from the camera, toward the figure who was no longer visible. It was the gaze of a man caught in perpetual quarrel, unable to rest even for the sake of a photograph. I folded the image back into its envelope, but the damage had already traveled into me. The archivist replaced the box with undue care, as though he feared it might erupt. He said Petherick had never spoken of reconciliation, only of grievance, and then he added, almost shyly, that some quarrels live longer than those who wage them. I walked back into the quad, carrying with me not the weight of a dead man's books, but the pressure of a face erased, insisting more loudly by its absence than by any presence it might once have claimed. It was Lewis who brought me the diary, his expression a mixture of triumph and hesitation, as though he half knew he had stumbled upon something too convenient. He said the porter had found it under a pile of returned books, its spine creased, its pages heavy with the confessions of youth. He handed it to me as one presents evidence that promises resolution. I accepted it with the skepticism I reserve for answers that arrive too quickly. The diary belonged to a second-year student whose name I will not record, though it was written in looping hand across the flyleaf. The entries were fevered in the way only youth can manage, swinging between devotion and despair, a private theatre performed in ink. At first glance, they seemed to describe secret meetings with Dr. Julian Petherick. The writer referred to an older man, a figure of knowledge and danger, one who offered escape from the suffocating routines of lectures and chapel bells. Lewis hovered as I read aloud fragments. There was talk of clandestine evenings, of doors closed against the world, of whispers exchanged across narrow spaces. Phrases lingered in suggestion. He told me I should trust him. He gave me what no one else dared. Lewis shifted uneasily, muttering that it looked like a scandal about to be unearthed, and I could hear in his voice the desire for clarity, for something he could take back to the chief superintendent with pride. But I have spent too many years with words to believe their first performance. I slowed my reading, allowed the sentences to unspool with less urgency. The student wrote not of Petherick by name, but of an ambiguous he. The passages about meetings were imprecise, the details blurred as if memory had chosen discretion, and then I noticed something small. The references were not to embraces or confidences, but to books. He lent me the volume I had only heard whispered about. He said no one else must know. I held it in the dark and felt as though I were reading something forbidden. Forbidden books, not forbidden love. I looked again at the feverish tone, and I saw the hunger of a young mind intoxicated by the forbidden rather than by a man. Petherick's name appeared only once, in passing and in a different context altogether. A lecture, a remark, no intimacy attached. The unnamed, he was someone else entirely. A tutor, perhaps, a friend, possibly the very man whose face had been excised from the photograph. Lewis flushed when I pointed it out, embarrassed by his eagerness. He muttered that the writing had seemed clear enough. I told him that clarity is often the most misleading quality of all, and I allowed myself the indulgence of a smile. Not unkind, but the smile of a man who has seen illusions parade too confidently before. Still, the diary unsettled me, for it revealed a culture of secrecy, of books passed hand to hand in defiance of rules, of students convinced they had discovered knowledge that could remake them. Petherick's death might not belong to this world, but it brushed against it. The college kept its corridors well polished, yet here was evidence of shadows moving within. I closed the diary and let it rest on the desk. The ink still smelled faintly metallic, as though the words were not finished with their work. Outside, the quad echoed with the hollow laughter of undergraduates, already moving on to other distractions. Lewis asked if I wished to pursue the matter further. I said only that the truth rarely announces itself with trumpets, and that for the moment the diary should be placed back among the papers. Later, alone, I thought again of the line. He gave me what no one else dared. The phrase could mean a book, or it could mean something less tangible. Permission, perhaps, to trespass. I did not know yet. What I did know was that Petherick's death remained resistant to easy scandal, and that any door which appeared to be open must first be examined for the trick of the lock. There are conversations one approaches like doorways, hesitant, uncertain of what lies beyond, and yet unable to resist the impulse to cross. My meetings with Helen Marbury belonged to that category. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense, yet she possessed the kind of poise that renders beauty a redundant term. Her intelligence, honed to a cold clarity, did not invite affection, but it did command attention. I found myself attending more closely than I had intended. We agreed, or perhaps I contrived, to share a late dinner in one of the smaller restaurants near St. Giles. The place was discreet, its tables half lost in the penumbra of lamps that seemed more intent on keeping secrets than illuminating them. Helen arrived precisely on time, her coat rain-speckled, her gloves tucked neatly into a handbag that looked older than fashion, but better cared for than affection. She apologized for nothing. Our conversation drifted at first to neutral subjects, the weariness of committees, the idiocy of undergraduates who believed themselves to be original, the quiet satisfaction of an archive newly catalogued. She spoke with composure, as if each sentence had been considered before being granted permission to leave her lips. Yet beneath the surface, I detected something withheld, a sentence half-formed, a silence too carefully arranged. I asked, in a tone deliberately light, whether she had known Petherick well. Her eyes did not flicker, though her hand paused upon the stem of her glass. She said they had been colleagues, nothing more, and that their conversations were strictly academic. The words were correct, but correctness has its own kind of betrayal. I pressed no further. It is in denial, not admission, that truth most often glimmers. It was Lewis, earlier, who had hinted at a rumor. An affection once shared, discreet but never entirely buried. I carried the rumor into dinner, not as accusation, but as atmosphere. Helen did not deny with outrage. She denied with calm, and that was what convinced me she was lying. Outrage is easier than stillness. The food arrived and passed without comment, though I noted she ate sparingly, as if her attention were occupied elsewhere. When she spoke again, It was to remark on the subject of keys. She said some locks are meant to be left unturned. A phrase delivered casually, almost idly, yet it struck me as too perfect to be casual. I stored it away, the way one keeps a fragment of melody whose meaning will later reveal itself. Afterward, we walked briefly beneath the dripping eaves of St. Giles. The rain had thinned to a mist that blurred the lamps into trembling halos. She thanked me with courtesy, but no warmth. Her footsteps retreated quickly, measured, as though she had already determined the length of our acquaintance. I stood a moment longer, watching her dissolve into the city, the faint click of her heels growing fainter with each step. There is a particular ache in speaking with a woman who understands you and yet will never allow you to cross the line between comprehension and closeness. Helen's distance was not rudeness, but preservation. She had built a fortress out of intellect, and though one might glimpse through the arrow slit a suggestion of tenderness, the gates remained fastened. It was, I admitted to myself, a fortress I had visited before under many names, always to be turned away. Back in my rooms, I poured a small measure of whiskey and unfolded the crossword. Yet the clue in front of me blurred with her words. Some locks are meant to be left unturned. A remark of no consequence, perhaps, but I felt its edge press against the memory of Petherick's door, the key placed neatly upon the desk, the room arranged as though to tell a story it had not truly lived. I let the whiskey settle in my throat and closed the paper unfinished. Some doors, I thought, invite entry only because they conceal a darker emptiness within. And some women remain in shadow, not because they are unseen, but because they choose the shadow over the exposure of light. Helen Marbury belonged to that category, and her silence lingered longer than any answer she might have offered. Anthony Fell had the kind of charm that curdles quickly when held too close to light. In the senior common room, he laughed too easily, spoke too warmly, and carried himself with the breezy grace of a man convinced the world would forgive him anything. Yet charm is an expensive habit, and Oxford salaries are not designed to subsidize recklessness. It was Lewis who first unearthed the bursar's files, the quiet arithmetic that refused to balance. We sat together in a small office where dust motes drifted like suspended punctuation. Lewis spread the papers across the desk, his finger tapping at figures that betrayed their keeper. Fell had borrowed against college accounts. Small diversions at first, then larger sums concealed under euphemisms: hospitality, research allowance, discretionary fund. The numbers bloomed into deficit, and in the margins of one letter, Petherick's handwriting appeared, sharp as flint. This cannot continue. I will not remain silent. Lewis, pleased at the neatness of it, declared we had found our motive. Petherick, the punctilious fellow, discovers his colleague's dishonesty. Fell, desperate, fearing exposure, arranges the room, places the key, stages the final scene. Simple, brutal, convincing. Lewis pressed for action, suggested an interview, perhaps even an arrest. His voice carried that rare eagerness of the policeman who believes he has solved the puzzle before the pieces are dry. I said nothing for a long while. I let the figures stare back at me, rows of debts like gravestones in a forgotten cemetery. Fell's guilt was possible, even plausible, but the symmetry disturbed me. Crimes that arrange themselves so perfectly are rarely true. I have seen enough of life to know it prefers disorder. Poetry delights in neatness, in mirrored images and balanced lines. Crime does not. We met Fell later that afternoon in his rooms overlooking the quad. He greeted us with wine already uncorked, an air of hospitality disguising unease. He admitted, too, financial strain, confessed with theatrical weariness that debt was his constant companion. But theft? No, never theft. Mismanagement, perhaps, overgenerosity to students, the odd indiscretion at the betting tables. He protested that Petherick had exaggerated, had sought to wound him with his reputation for integrity. Fell's eyes glittered as he spoke, and I could not decide whether it was the reflection of the lamplight or the nervous sheen of a man rehearsing excuses. Lewis pressed him, mentioned the letter, the sums, the threats of exposure. Fell sighed, a sound carefully weighted with resignation, and said Petherick had always despised him, had always sought to portray him as a dilettante. He refilled his glass, offered us nothing, and leaned back as if to say that the college, like Oxford itself, would not allow one of its own to be destroyed for mere numbers. Walking back through the cloister, Lewis muttered that Fell was guilty enough for 2 men. His debts, his evasions, his easy laughter concealing panic. It all added up. And it did. Too well. That was the problem. I told him life rarely arranges itself in perfect patterns. That is poetry, not crime. A murderer does not balance his lines like Milton or polish his meter like Pope. He stumbles, he contradicts himself, he leaves fingerprints of chaos in the margins. Fell's case was too graceful, too designed. He had motive, yes, but motive alone is never enough. It is the untidy detail that convicts, the hairline crack in an otherwise symmetrical facade. Lewis frowned, dissatisfied, and folded the bursar's papers under his arm. I watched him stride ahead, eager for certainty, while I lingered beneath the dripping arch. The rain struck stone with irregular rhythm, never quite resolving into pattern. That, I thought, is what truth feels like. Untidy, uneven, a music without meter. Fell might be guilty, but the story, as it stood, was too clean to trust. The porter had the patience of a man who has seen too many generations of undergraduates discover their own cleverness. His lodge smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and damp wool, and the shelves behind him displayed a regiment of keys, each one glinting with its own small history. He told his story slowly, as though reluctant to commit himself, but once begun, he would not stop. The night before Petherick's death, he said, he had glimpsed someone slipping through the quad. A cloaked figure, hurried but not running, the stride determined yet weighed down by something unseen. He had thought little of it at the time. Cloaks are common enough in Oxford when the evening damp settles on the stones, and fellows often skulk away from conversations they cannot conclude. Only later, when the news broke, had the sight troubled him. He offered the memory now with the air of one surrendering a reluctant witness. Lewis seized on the detail. A cloak. A fellow. Suspicion narrowed itself naturally towards Doctor Rowan, the classicist, whose dislike of Petherick was no secret. Rowan, with his rigid adherence to formality, his disdain for Petherick's literary ventures, his voice sharpened by rivalry. And Rowan was known to favor the old-fashioned scholar's cloak, wearing it like a badge of superiority. The image was convenient, almost too much so, a man with motive, wrapped in the very garment that marked him out. We went to Rowan's rooms that afternoon. He greeted us with cold civility, his desk littered with Greek texts whose margins bore notes as precise as the man himself. He denied, with clipped disdain, any involvement in Petherick's affairs. He admitted dislike, yes. Petherick had been lax, sentimental, too concerned with students' opinions. But murder? Absurd. His eyes glared with the fury of one insulted by implication, not frightened by accusation. He adjusted his cloak, hanging on the back of his chair, and asked if we required further entertainment or if our intrusion might end. Lewis muttered on the way out that Rowan had all but confessed. He wore the cloak. He had the motive. He walked the quad that night. The pattern, to Lewis, seemed unshakable. But I heard again the porter's phrasing, the peculiar poetry of his observation. The figure walked, he had said, as if she carried the whole of Oxford upon her shoulders. Not he. She. The words had slipped out naturally, unexamined, uncorrected. The porter, of course, might have been careless. A slip of the tongue, the pronoun chosen without thought. Yet such slips often speak more truth than the statements polished for accuracy. I replayed the vision in my head, the figure cloaked, the stride heavy, the posture not of a man hurrying away from guilt, but of someone burdened, perhaps by memory, perhaps by sorrow. Rowan's disdain for Petherick had the clean edges of rivalry, not the blurred contours of murder. His hatred was intellectual, almost professional. Hatred of that variety prefers to wound in committee, not in solitude. The porter repeated his tale once more when I pressed him gently. Again the same phrasing, again the subtle emphasis. She carried the whole of Oxford upon her shoulders. He frowned when I asked directly if he was certain, as though suddenly aware of his own words. Perhaps, perhaps not, he said. He could not swear to gender. The cloak had obscured too much, but the image remained fixed in him, the weight, the slow gravity of her walk. That night, in my rooms, I thought again of Helen Marbury, her guarded eyes, her remark about locks best left unturned. I thought of the photograph with its erased face, of debts too tidy, of motives that polished themselves into patterns. The truth seemed less like a puzzle being solved than a tapestry being tugged loose by a single frayed thread. Lewis argued for Rowan. The chief superintendent would be satisfied with Rowan, but I could not be. The porter's words clung like ivy, soft yet insistent. Sometimes a phrase carries more weight than evidence, more danger than fact. And I could not silence the image of a woman, cloaked, carrying all of Oxford upon her shoulders. Evenings in my flat follow a pattern that only I could mistake for comfort. The whiskey bottle keeps its steady vigil on the side table, the lamp burns with the tired dignity of age, and the crossword lies unfolded before me like an adversary that refuses to concede. That night I stared too long at a single clue. 7 letters. Key within door conceals truth. I tried answers. Candor, unlocks, passage. Each fell apart, letters collapsing into nonsense. Still, the clue pressed against memory as though trying to remind me of something I already knew. The flat was too quiet, save for the occasional cough of pipes and the rain stammering against the sill. I thought of Petherick's office, of the key placed with theatrical neatness upon the blotter, of the porter's insistence that the door had been closed. The scene had arranged itself too elegantly. A suicide written in clear script, waiting for the approval of a coroner. I distrusted it then. I distrusted it still. I turned back to the crossword. Key within door conceals truth. The letters might hide inside the word door itself, or perhaps within the word key. I scribbled possibilities, none convincing, and then a thought shifted, not in the clue but in me. The lock, the literal door, not metaphor, but carpentry. I remembered a conversation years ago, half heard in the quad, about the college locksmith, a man more loyal to habit than to precision. A lock changed, but imperfectly. A duplicate key forgotten, left among files as a SOP to bureaucracy. I stood, paced the narrow length of the room, let the memory uncoil. The bursar had once joked that Saint Eligius's locks were more symbolic than secure, that an entire cupboard in the lodge was filled with duplicates meant to be destroyed but never quite relinquished. I had smiled politely at the time, thinking nothing of it. Now the smile returned, edged with something darker. If the duplicate key still existed, then the scene in Petherick's office could be staged. The door closed, the lock turned, the key placed ceremoniously upon the desk. It would appear sealed, final, inexplicable. Yet the true key, the other key, would rest elsewhere, its existence known only to those who troubled themselves with the minutiae of the college's untidiness. Lewis would not see it. He trusted locks to tell the truth, but locks are human, as fallible as their makers. The clue, key within door conceals truth, was not merely wordplay, it was description. The truth of Petherick's death lay not in despair or debt, but in the locksmith's error, hidden within the mechanism meant to keep certainty intact. I poured another measure, drank it slowly, and considered who might have known. The fellows, yes, but only those with patience for gossip or habit of haunting the lodge. The porter himself, certainly. Helen Marbury, perhaps, whose eyes always carried the weight of untold knowledge. Fell might have known, if desperation had sharpened his hearing. Rowan, too proud to admit interest in practicalities, seemed less likely. Still, the image unsettled me. The duplicate key, lying forgotten in a cupboard, like a spare truth waiting to be borrowed. Whoever had arranged Petherick's death had borrowed it, used it, and returned it. Or perhaps not returned it at all. The scene had been staged not with genius, but with the small advantage of remembering what others had chosen to forget. I returned to the crossword and, almost reluctantly, filled the boxes. Cryptic. 7 letters. Not the official answer, perhaps, but close enough to the truth. A lock concealing another lock. A key hidden in the files of a college that prided itself on knowledge yet mislaid its own secrets. I closed the paper, switched off the lamp, and sat in the darkness. The rain eased, leaving silence like a wound. Somewhere in that silence I could hear the soft click of a key turning in a door. Not closing it, but arranging it for someone else to find. Petherick's papers had been gathered into a neat bundle, the kind of posthumous order that feels less like tidiness and more like concealment. They lay in a cardboard box on my desk, each sheet sighing faintly when touched, as though resenting the light after so much patient waiting. I'd skimmed them before. Lecture notes, a draft of an article, correspondence with publishers and students. But that evening I began again, slower, letting each line breathe. It was a short letter that caught me. At first glance, unremarkable. No more than a polite refusal of an invitation, dated some month prior. I had read it once without interest, but now, restless with the taste of whiskey on my tongue and the crossword unfinished at my elbow, I let my eyes settle on it more fully. The handwriting was precise, though a little too careful, as if the writer had slowed her hand to disguise familiarity. The content was banal. Regret at being unable to attend, gratitude for the thought, the promise of another occasion. But at the close lay the word that snagged me. Yours. Written once, then again. The second slightly darker, as if correcting itself, though the first remained legible beneath. A hesitation, a falter in the wrist, an intimacy quickly withdrawn. It is remarkable how little the eye requires before memory insists on recognition. The curl of the Y, the faint restraint in the S. I had seen it before, across signatures in the college register, in marginalia on borrowed texts. Helen Marbury. Written not boldly, but behind a veil, the hand slowed and slightly altered. Disguise, but not escape. The letter opened in me a corridor of recollections. Her remark at dinner, some locks are meant to be left unturned. The misquoted Milton, light refused to dwell. The porter's phrase, careless yet persistent, as if she carried the whole of Oxford upon her shoulders. Each had unsettled me on its own. Now they gathered, like fragments of a melody aligning into tune. I read the letter again, aloud this time, my voice sounding oddly formal in the room. The repetition of yours seemed almost confessional, as though affection had betrayed itself and then been hastily corrected. A moment of intimacy pressed flat under the weight of propriety. To whom had she written? To Petherick himself, surely. And why was the note among his papers, if not cherished, or perhaps weaponized? Lewis, had he been there, would have asked for certainty, for proof inked in evidence. But proof is often less reliable than suggestion. Handwriting, misquotation, a phrase half idly spoken, these weigh more heavily in my scale than fingerprints. A crime of passion never leaves its signature in blood alone. It writes itself in hesitation, in slips of the tongue, in the betrayal of style. I let the papers rest, though the letter remained in my hand, its weight absurdly slight for what it carried. I thought of Helen, seated by the fire in the common room, her eyes fixed upon the flames as though memory were housed there. I thought of her calm denial, so polished it could only be false. And I thought of the porter's shadowed figure, cloaked, bearing the slow gravity of someone accustomed to carrying more than she could ever confess. The room grew darker, the lamplight gathering into a cone that left the corners obscured. I sat listening to the silence, broken only by the faint rustle of the papers, shifting as if Petherick himself stirred within them. The college bells tolled the hour, but I paid them no attention. My mind remained on the doubled word, yours and yours again, echoing in its own hesitation. For the first time since Petherick's body had been discovered, the narrative began to bend away from neatness, away from debts and rivalries, towards something more intimate, more dangerous. A woman's hand, a slip in verse, a key long forgotten, a lock that had never truly kept anyone out. The symmetry was gone. What remained was truth, its edges blurred, but cutting all the same. The cloisters of St. Eligius at dusk are a place designed for silence. The stones breathe damply, the arches lean inward as if listening, and every step lingers longer than it should. I chose that setting deliberately, for truth requires its own theatre, and Helen Marbury was not a woman to be cornered in an office or caught in the glare of a policeman's lamp. She deserved, or demanded, a stage both grave and merciful. She came without protest, her figure moving through the half-light with the composure of one who has long rehearsed every gesture. The air smelled of wet stone and fading blossoms, a scent that seemed to suit her restraint. I told her quietly that I had read the letter again, that I had seen her hand upon it despite the disguise. I spoke of the Milton line, of the porter's silhouette, of the remark about locks unturned. She did not flinch at any of it. She only lowered her gaze for a moment, then lifted it again with the calm of acceptance. "Yes," she said, and the word seemed less admission than release. She spoke with a steadiness that unsettled me more than denial ever could. Julian Petherick had threatened her. Not crudely, not publicly, but with the measured malice of a man who knows the fragility of reputation. Years ago, she confessed, they had been more than colleagues. A brief affair, concealed, spoken of only in shadows. She had ended it, determined to preserve her career, her dignity, the fragile respect that women in academia must defend with greater ferocity than men ever imagine. But Petherick had not forgotten. Recently, he had hinted at exposure, perhaps in pique, perhaps in cruelty. The letter had been his lever, her silence his prey. In desperation, she remembered what others had forgotten. The locksmith's mistake, the duplicate key lying dormant in the college files. She took it, entered his office when the quad was dark and rain had softened the air, and found him already weary with drink. They argued, his words cut sharper than any blade. When he fell silent at last, she arranged the scene with a scholar's precision. The key upon the blotter, the glass by his hand, the door closed against discovery. She had meant it to look inevitable, a despair too neat to question. Her voice did not break as she recounted it. Indeed, there was something almost serene in the telling, as if confession itself had been waiting longer than the deed. Her eyes, those watchful eyes that had always seemed to guard their own perimeter, now opened without resistance. I saw not triumph, nor even shame, but a kind of relief, as though at last she could lay down the burden she had carried across the stones of Oxford. Lewis would have wanted her arrested then and there, words recorded, statements taken. But in the cloister, with the evening bells dissolving into the mist, procedure felt irrelevant. I asked her why she had quoted Milton wrongly, why she had chosen that particular slip. She smiled faintly, almost wistfully, and said she no longer remembered. perhaps because she had wanted light to refuse to dwell upon her own eyes. A scholar's error, a woman's plea. We stood for a while, without speech. The cloister absorbed her words and returned them as silence. She said at last that she would not resist whatever must follow, that reputation was already lost, and that the truth, once spoken, was its own form of liberation. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. In her composure, I felt the melancholy certainty that she had carried this outcome within her from the moment she lifted the forgotten key. When she turned away, her steps measured beneath the arches. I watched without moving. Confession had not destroyed her. It had delivered her into a strange kind of peace. I remained behind, the evening pressing close, the echo of her words still resonant. Some locks, she had told me once, are meant to be left unturned. And yet she had turned one, and the cost of that turn now hung in the Oxford air, heavy as the rain that began again, tapping its patient verdict against the ancient stone. The Randolph bar was quieter than usual, though perhaps it was I who had grown louder inside my own silence. A glass stood before me, amber light trembling in its depths, and the crossword lay unfolded but unfinished, its blank squares staring back with quiet reproach. I'd filled some clues, abandoned others, but the pattern would not resolve itself, much like the case I had supposedly closed. Outside, Oxford carried on with its indifferent grace. The bells tolled across the city, a sequence of echoes dissolving into damp air. Students hurried beneath umbrellas, their voices thin against the rain. A cab splashed through a puddle, its lights bending in the glass of the window. From within, it all looked rehearsed, as though the city were performing its evening liturgy, oblivious to the failures of one solitary man nursing whiskey and half-thoughts. Lewis telephoned, his voice steady, practical, filling the receiver with details of procedure. The report filed, the evidence stored, the necessary words exchanged with the chief superintendent. He spoke of Helen, of remand, of formalities that had already begun to grind into their bureaucratic rhythm. I listened, or seemed to, offering small replies that convinced neither of us. My thoughts strayed elsewhere, following the faint trail of her words as they had lingered in the cloister. Some doors should remain closed. She had said it almost casually once, over dinner, yet in the end it was her benediction, her epitaph, the phrase that refused to let me go. I heard it now as if she were seated opposite me, her hands folded, her eyes carrying their familiar restraint. Doors, locks, keys. The banal furniture of security transformed into metaphors heavier than truth. I looked again at the crossword. The clue I had abandoned earlier asked for a word meaning hidden truth. I left it blank. For truth is not hidden in grids or dictionaries. It is hidden in people, in their hesitations, their slips of the tongue, the tremor of a pen that writes yours twice when once would suffice. Helen had revealed herself in those ways long before she confessed, and I had seen it only belatedly, as always, too late. I drained my glass slowly, felt the ache of regret press against the ribs like an unwelcome lodger. Case is close, paperwork concludes, but regret remains stubborn, immune to verdicts. Helen was guilty, yes, but guilt in Oxford rarely travels alone. It is always accompanied by loneliness, by longing, by the endless weight of what might have been otherwise. The barman drifted by, polished the wood without speaking, and left me to the company of my own shadows. I thought of Petherick, of his tidy office, of the key placed with ceremonial care upon the blotter. A gesture rehearsed for effect, but in the end meaningless. The real key had never been on the desk. The real key had always been elsewhere. In a cupboard forgotten, in a memory disguised, in the quiet resolve of a woman who had run out of choices. I murmured the thought aloud, though no one was near enough to hear. The key was always inside. It was not revelation, merely resignation, the kind of truth that arrives when nothing useful can be done with it. The words hung briefly in the air, then dissolved, as if the city itself had absorbed them. I folded the crossword and slipped it into my pocket unfinished. The bells tolled again, slower now, or perhaps it was only my hearing that dragged. Outside, the rain had not stopped. It rarely does. Oxford wears rain as its second skin, and I walked out into it without umbrella, letting the cold drops erase what the whiskey could not.